Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 137th edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And for those of you watching for the first time or listening to the first time, there's two elderly guys who chat every week, and we generally have a guest. And if you're watching on the video, you'll know exactly who the elderly guys are. So we've got a guest with us today, Dan Worsley. Hello, Dan.
Good morning.
Good morning. Now, Dan's been a guest with us before, Dan, do you want to just explain, what you're about, what you do, and perhaps why you're on here? Because we're just heading into World Book Day, and this might be of help to schools who can't get an author into their schools during that period of time.
Fingers crossed, yeah. I'll give you a potted history then of where it started. So I was a primary school teacher for 15 years in a large three-form entry school in Blackpool, taught across Key Stage 2 and into Key Stage 1. And then decided after 15 years working with thousands of fantastic Blackpool children to pursue my other dream. Teaching was always my passion, but I loved writing. So for the last 10 years, I've been writing children's books, working with children in schools, libraries, or public areas all across the country. And that now is how I end up being, called about 6 or 7 months in advance for World Book Day bookings.
Wow.
World Book Day should be every day.
Every day.
World Book Day is marvellous, but every day should be a World Book Day for sure.
Yeah, great. Now, actually, I think, is it 6 children's books you're up to now?
Yeah, so peeping over my shoulder, we've got Eric Appleby. So Eric is the star of, he's got 3 books that start off with Zero to Hero. So Zero to Hero tells the story of a lonely little boy who doesn't believe in himself, really struggles with life, wants to be an action hero, but he knows that really action heroes only exist in films. Until one day, a super villain called Ivana the Cash turns up at Eric's school, kidnaps all the children apart from him, of course, and he has to save the day. So that's where Eric's story started, and then we went to Danger Zone. His dad goes missing, has to save his father's life, and then of course every action hero needs his trilogy completing, and so World Saver finished the trilogy off. So I'm really lucky to work with an amazing illustrator called Martin Spohr, who when I lived in Blackpool, lived across the road from me.
Really?
So well, I lived in a little village near Pulteney-Field, and illustrator on one side of the street and author on the other. So we met by chance.
So I'm interested though, because those are very dynamic sort of pictures, aren't they? In some respects, that's the thing that draws a reader into your book, isn't it?
I think so.
Is that the thing that gets you? Are you conscious when you write the first paragraph that you've really got perhaps a page or a page and a half to break through to the reader, and how does that affect how you write it?
I think I try to hit the ground running. Obviously, you've got to set the scene and set up the premises at the start, but I do like to hit the ground running. And I had a feeling you're probably going to ask me to read something this morning, so I was leafing through looking for extracts.
We will.
So later on, maybe I've got an extract for you that does show that how to launch straight into a piece of writing that does hook the reader and makes them want to keep reading. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Would you want to do it now, Dan? Because I'm not sure. Have you got it?
Okay. Yeah. No problem. So as well as writing the Eric stories, I write Impossible Tales. So this book is coming up for 10 years old now. Impossible Tales are crazy, weird, wacky short stories, and then we have more Impossible Tales with the Impossible Child on the front. So the Impossible Child proves great fun when I go to events and we can all pull impossible faces, and the teachers tend to sneak out the way when we're doing pictures for social media and so they don't get captured. And then when lockdown happened and I couldn't visit schools for quite a serious amount of time, we created even more Impossible Tales with the Impossible Girl on the front. So that's the collection of 6. So if I just give you a taster, so Impossible Tales. Some Impossible Tales are weird, some are wacky, some will make you gasp, some will make you laugh. This one was written I would say probably 7 years ago, probably. And I collaborated with Blackpool Libraries when I lived in Blackpool, and to create a seaside themed story. So this is about a creature, a sea creature, and it's called Fear of the Unknown. And it starts with a raging storm. Lightning illuminated the pitch black night sky. Deafening thunder noisily rumbled and crashed. Down below, the sea was a boiling cauldron. The vicious waves raged, battering a helpless boat and causing the vessel to pitch and tip. The captain sent out desperate calls while the rest of the crew frantically battled to save the stricken boat. One way or another, the merciless sea was going to devour its prey. It was simply a matter of time before the boat was dragged down to a watery graveyard. Now, out on deck, there was a small wooden crate which was chained at the rear of the boat. The boat tipped. The crate broke free from its shackles. It began to slide sideways before colliding with the metal guardrail. The crate splintered, leaving a long crack down one side. From the darkness within the crate, a high-pitched shriek emerged before a glowing red eye stared out through the splintered wood. It took in the stormy chaos. The captive within the crate was desperate to escape. And they always say, leave it on a good bit, so we'll leave it on that bit now. So that story started live, thinking of a setting. So the seaside was the setting, and then you have the question, what lies beneath? What's beneath those waves that we do not know about? And there, the creature came to life. So
It's funny because I couldn't. I was trying to think about that as a Victorian setting. I wasn't, because you don't explain, whether that's a modern story or an old story.
Yep.
But I located it immediately in Victorian times. I don't know, what was your response to that, Stan?
Yeah, it was a bit Dracula, Whitby, the sea at Whitby. That was what was going. That was the image I had in my mind. Yeah.
Well, for me, ultimately, that story came to life sitting on a bench on Blackpool Promenade, looking out to sea, and wondering what was out there. And if something had been captured, how then could it escape? So that's how the story seed, as I call it, starts. Right. So once you've got that seed, then you start to think and daydream and plot, and the seed grows into a story. And I didn't want to go down the lines of a creature that ended up, causing havoc and harming people. I almost turned it on its head, and the creature in the story is a creature that helps. So it turns up at a little seaside town and it helps the people, but it's actually quite misunderstood that they're frightened, and they end up chasing this creature away. So there's almost a message there of don't judge a book by its cover, don't jump to conclusions. So that's a story that I use quite a lot in schools, that children will pick apart the creature in my story, then recreate their own, and we come up with eyewitness accounts, and they pick out the missing segments of the story, what actually happened in that part, how does the creature help. And I know one school in Blackpool actually used that piece of writing as a theme for writing various pieces of writing about it. So it's fantastic that it's generated so much interest and got children using their imaginations.
So that's something you get a number of schools, children, even adults who are perhaps wanting to turn themselves into children's authors. Do they write directly to you?
Yeah, I hear from quite a lot of people actually, and I always on school visits end up with children who tell me that they want to be authors, which is fantastic. And they say, Dan, can you please give me some advice to be an author? I said I'm going to give you 3 pieces of advice. So my first piece of advice is you need to read lots of books, and I can see them nodding. Yeah. And the second piece of advice is read some more books. Okay. Well, what's the third piece? The third piece, read even more books. So the readers become writers. And I tell children that in every school I go to, and I can almost go around classes and say to the children, you read books. I know you read. You can just feel the way they write, the way they talk. They are just readers. Readers become writers. So any children listening to this now, and if your teacher has said to you, you need to read, you need to do some reading, they are telling you that because they know that it will help you with your writing. Definitely.
I was thinking there are some pupils who actually prefer non-fiction to fiction, you know, and actually that's an element of reading. But actually, do you think that not focusing on fiction actually sort of makes it more difficult for you to write creatively because you're focusing more on the non-fiction side of it?
Um, I'll be honest with you. Looking back, putting my teacher hat back on now. Back in the days as a teacher, the Guinness Book of Records was probably one of the most borrowed books in my class. And the the factual books, because I think those little bite-sized pieces of information often fantastic that children would use the illustrations, the pictures to sort of back up what they were seeing. Now, for me, I tell children reading is reading. It doesn't matter whether it's a newspaper, whether it's a comic, whether it's a graphic novel, non-fiction, fiction. It does not matter. You are a reader, whatever you're reading. And I think, looking back at, again, putting the teacher hat back on, the way that we write, often in non-chronological reports and stuff like that, we use non-fiction text. So non-fiction texts definitely have a big place, for writing, whether it be in class or for me, sort of for pleasure, definitely.
I think you've got to get that understanding that you read for all those different purposes. I'm just thinking, looking behind me now, that there's a whole range of books that I read for information on leadership, but above that, at the top there's a whole range of books on music in Manchester that I read a bit for information, but also for pleasure. And then all the books that I read entirely for pleasure, the detective novels and crime things, are all on another shelf in another room. So I read all those all the time. I still read a lot, but I understand in my own head why I'm reading things and why I pick things up and why I need to read some, and others I choose to read. And of course, because we've got technology now, most of my current books are on my Kindle.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what's your view about that, Dan? Have you got are you like Stan? It doesn't matter where the source of it is. It could be a digital device, or it could be a hardback or a paperback of your book. It doesn't really matter in your mind.
If I'm honest, I am old school. I'm a paperback reader, paperback writer, literally. I don't really. I haven't really gone for the Kindle or e-readers, no. But then, to be honest with you, if it's something that engages children and gets them into reading, I don't think it matters whether it is an e-reader or whether it's an actual, physical copy of the book. For me, as long as they're reading, it does not matter. No. But then I've got to say, at 46 years of age, I've just got my first pair of reading glasses. So, screen or book, I think it's broad, it's wrong now. Yeah. I'm definitely feeling my age. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I was definitely a book person, but when it got to going on holidays and restrictions on what you could carry in your case, what I was finding, there was more weight in books than there was clothes. Yeah. So the Kindle solves that problem straight away. Plus, it's easy to read on journeys. But I wanted to say, books have been important to me, and I found this. Well, I knew where it was. This is a book. I think this must be my first book, and it's presented from the Sunday school, and it was in 1960. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that book was when I was 4 years old, and I've kept that with others that mean so much to me as the first books that I.
So go on, son. You've got a couple there, haven't you? Do you want to just?
Yeah, I've got some older than that are Robinson Crusoe, which was my dad's book, presented in 1938. And I've got a book that my mother was given on her 17th birthday. So that will be, again, in the early 40s. And these get passed on. These are books that you can't do anything with but save. And I have to say, our problem in the house is we've got so many books. we can't find room for them all. And then I was thinking of books that have made a big difference, or the ones that I've read most. I know it's a very famous book, but that's probably the book that I've read at least 3 times in my life, having laughed at people when I was 12, 13, really laughed at people that read books about elves and gnomes and things like that. But once you've got into that, and then the other book that I've put to one side is one I really loved reading to children when I was a teacher, which is Bill Norton. It's a book of small stories, this one, but the story that I used to love more than any was Spit Nolan.
Yeah.
And then just picking up Dan's thing about leading people in, my favourite book to read long term in a class at the end of each day was The Weird Stone of Brisingamen by Alan Garner, because it's written in a way that you can guarantee that as you get to the end of each chapter, you got everybody waiting for the next bit, and you can say, right, well, it's 3:30 now, so we won't get to that next bit now until tomorrow or the day after. So yeah, books are really, really part of my life and always have been. And my problem is I can't give them away or throw them away. We just build up a store. So that's why Kindles come to my rescue.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested, Dan, in your first set of books were about Eric Appleby, weren't they? They were about, and obviously he was this little superhero. I mean, what happens when you did the trilogy, and then did you move on then to these Impossible Tales, or did an Impossible Tale come in before the end of that? And my issue here is around how do you break free from the Eric Appleby, and the Impossible Tales? That must be because there are people out there probably say, "Oh, give us a bit more of that," but that might not be what you want to do. That those ideas might not be fermenting in your brain at the moment.
Yeah, and just before I talk about that, I will say, and Stan, everything he was saying about his bookshelves filling there totally resonated there, and actually something that I've tried over the last year or so is to use my local libraries more, and the stocks that they have. Amazing source of books. Plus, I think we've got to love our libraries, keep our libraries going, support our libraries, and so yeah, definitely libraries. And I'm telling children now, get signed up. I did library gigs in Wigan last week and the week before, and telling children, get library cards, get signed up. We need libraries. Do support libraries.
Well, just to say, my daughter was a librarian for a number of years. And she's got a master's degree in children's literature. So whatever my wife and I did about books certainly was caught on by my daughter, who for the last 5 or 6 years has threatened to write a book, but she's got all these ideas and most of it's written in chunks. But I'm afraid she's now getting married and things are very different. Priorities have suddenly changed. But yeah, I think it's a love of books that you can pass on. And as I say, I've actually said to people now, stop buying me books because I can't house them anywhere.
Can I just say that's probably not the message we're trying to get across on work.
So sign you up for a library, Stan. That's what we need to do.
Yeah.
Sign you up for definitely. But to go back to the question you asked about being locked into a trilogy or a series of books, yeah, I feel at times that I'm riding a runaway train. That the audience do want more Impossible Tales, they want more short stories, and they want more Eric. I mean, I sat down with the illustrator and we tried to bring this series to a conclusion in the trilogy, and I do feel it almost has been brought to a conclusion. But of course, now the one thing that children are used to, it's a spin-off. They want a spin-off. Right. So even though we finished the trilogy and that story as it was standing has come to a close, they're now suggesting ideas after reading the books that we could use to make other stories.
Wow. So a letter or an email that somebody sends you, may just be an innocuous. Have you ever thought of could actually be the origins of the next trilogy?
Yeah, and I do try to listen to the audience, because the one thing that children told me years ago, Dan, you need to write a unicorn story. Write a story about unicorns. And I sort of, this idea, it fermented, and I thought, what can I do? I don't want to go down your stereotypical unicorn and, magic twinkles. So I ended up creating, for the last Impossible Tales, a story about a little Shetland pony called Dave, who actually, he is a unicorn, but no one realizes it.
Right.
And he has a little lump on his head, and when he jumps, his tail comes up, and he does a trump that fires out stardust twinkles and things like that. So I did put the unicorn story in there. So that's sort of like that's quelled one sort of demand. But yeah, Eric spin-offs. That's the demand at the moment. Whether we'll do it, I don't know. I haven't got anything fresh in my mind that we could go off on another series and start something else. But the Impossible Tales just go on and on. Maybe scary is the vibe I get at the moment. Scary, middle grade readers, so your 7 to 11, 7 to 12s, they seem to be liking the scary stories. I think maybe on the back of Stranger Things and stuff like that at the moment. So yeah, possibly something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, can you give us some idea of the you know, I mean, you must be asked this all the time, you know, your life as an author. I mean, is it very clearly disciplined in that you sort of in effect to this room where you are now, which might be a study or a bedroom or somewhere in your house, and actually discipline yourself to do the writing during a certain period of time, or are you much freer and just, you know, when the mood takes you?
It's interesting because when I was out walking the dog the other day, and I do ponder when I walk the dog, it's a bit of head clarity, and I did think to myself how different life is now compared to teacher life, because teacher life was very structured, very organized, everything was fitted in, whereas now it seems to fluctuate. So I'll have days when it's 100 miles an hour and I'm so busy, and I'll have other days when it calms down and I can sit to write. But one thing that I do tell the children, that I am in no way, I'm not someone who has a writing shed. I don't have a special building at the bottom of my garden. I live in a relatively small house, and I'll often just sit in the lounge downstairs with the laptop on my knee, and I'll write that way. Some days I can write in a burst of 7-8 hours. Some days I might get an hour in there, but I can go for weeks without writing anything. If there's nothing in there and there's no stories that I think I want to get down, I'll just jot. I'll jot in my notebook, which I brought here. One of my friends brought this years ago. So this is my book of weird observations, which is quite fitting actually for some of the things that go in this book. And a mate of mine bought me this, and he said, "There you go, put all your stories, ideas in there." So yeah, it's very, very sporadic, I think, if we're using a word. But then some days I'm out on visits. I can, the next 4 or 5 weeks, I'm literally out most days working in school. So I don't have the time to write. But then I'll have quiet time over the summer when possibly I'll settle and get into something.
So, Dan, when you've sort of drafted your first piece and you think, right, that I've got the story now and I've written most of it, how many revisions does that take when it goes via publishers, etc., before it goes out?
Right. Okay. So it all starts off once you've got the idea for the story, and I say to the children, and this is really important, the first draft is never the best draft, and you've got to remember that. The first draft is what I like to call the brain emptier. It's the one that gets all these ideas in these tangled, knotted sentences and thoughts onto a page. And that's why it's hard to start it, because with a blank piece of paper, it's really difficult. But you've just got to go for it. And you've got to accept that there will be some bits in there that are good, some bits that are all right, and some bits that are terrible that you are going to get rid of. So the editing process, I think if you liken it to real life, if you think in your garden, if you've got a hedge that's totally overgrown and wild, that's the first draft. And if you get the clippers out and start to shape it and trim bits there, and you start to craft it, and that's what the editing process is. So for me, the first draft turns into a second, and I look at the whole story. So you start with the whole thing. So you look at the content, and then you focus in. So you then go in and look at maybe your paragraphs into your sentences and your openers, and you focus then right down into the sentence structure. So I would say usually I'll do 5 or 6 drafts before we're looking to be ready to put it out. But there are always readers who will read the story in the early stages who I want to be brutal. They need to tell me that bits are rubbish, that bits don't make sense. And some people are so lovely that they tell me it's the best thing they've ever read. I know that's not true. So I need honest critics. Yeah. So any children who are listening to this, you must always realize when your teacher says to you, go and have another look at it, as I say in schools, and all the children look at the yeah, we all know that. They're telling you because they know that what you've got is not your best piece of writing. First draft is never best draft.
I think, Stan, what was going through my mind as Dan was talking there was we had a brutal experience in 1995, 96. I won't tell you what it was and how that person was brutal to us, but it was a kind brutalness. It was, if that's a term, the person was really toughening up our writing, making it much clearer, much sharper, and I think generally, Stan, much shorter, getting to the.
I've got an appraisal that says Stan's writing is getting better.
I don't know how
40.
But I think that's for me. I think that when I think about the work I do now, I do a lot of reading, and I have to find time for the sort of my reading. I do a lot of reading related to work, and I have quite a bit of stuff published, and I'm very keen on social media, so that involves some form of writing. But the book I'm reading at the moment is by a woman called Kerry Hudson, and it's called Lowborn. And Kerry Hudson is an author who had a very, very challenging upbringing, and so her mother and her sister must have gone to, I don't know, countless towns where they would live in B&Bs, and it's amazing that Kerry could actually get to a position where she could be an author. Bearing in mind, I don't know how many schools she went to, but she speaks very highly of teachers who read to her, encouraged her, because they had no books in their house. They'd moved from one flat to another flat. The last thing they were thinking was, oh, we've got to grab all the books. There weren't any. So the point she makes about the local library and the power of the teacher bringing new books, new experiences through reading aloud to Kerry was a fundamental part of her understanding how she could draw on her experience, and some of them were awful, but some of those good and not so good experiences were going into that brain of hers. And Lowborn is about her revisiting some of the towns that she visited, she stayed in, and seeing them now as they were, and remembering what they were like when she was there, and what they're like now. And in some cases they're massively different, and in other cases they are just really quite depressing. So it's all those life experiences have come to Kerry, and she's a successful author now. So it also makes me wonder. My brother was an avid reader, and I wasn't, and his bedroom was full of books. But I can honestly say we only had 3 books in the house, and that was the New Testament, the Old Testament, and a prayer book. And these were leather bound, which my mother was very proud of. And actually, when I think about, it must have been the library, it must have been the impact of my brother, it must have been the school that enabled me to find my way in being able to read and to write and to do all of this. It wasn't something that was given to us, so those difficult upbringings and not having a lot, I think, has really hit a chord with me with this Lowborn book.
That's probably, Frank, why I've still got some books from my very early childhood, because again, we weren't a well-off family at all, and so a book was almost a precious gift that you looked after and read and reread and reread. But I do think I have to say about a teacher when I was at grammar school, who shifted me from reading the sort of Enid Blyton style books, which I'd grown up on, to reading something that was much better crafted, much better written. And it was an English teacher who used to, 1 lesson a week, used to hand out from a box of books. You had to choose the book that you wanted and stick with it for weeks. And I read 2001. I would never have read that had it not been the only book in the box that I thought I might be interested in, and the discipline of, well, you will read it for the next 40 minutes for the next half term. And I read it and I read it and I really enjoyed it. And that shifted my reading to more serious fiction and non-fiction from childlike books. And I don't know to this day whether it was just an easy way to teach, you just give the books out, or whether it was inspirational.
But it
But
worked.
either way,
Effective.
yeah.
Did the job. But going back to one thing that you mentioned there about the author that you referenced there, Frank, I think writing is an escape. And I say that to the children, you know, and particularly with reference to COVID. When COVID struck and my work disappeared within a day, everything just went. All the school visits were just deleted. And I sat down and thought, right, I'm going to get lost. I've got the stories. I'm going to go for it. And literally just started to write and created even more impossible tales. And I think the vibe of some of those stories, and maybe a little bit darker, some of them, because of the mood and what was going on. So yeah, I do think it is a total escape, and it doesn't matter where you are in your life, because you can get lost in something that is totally different to what is going on in real life. So yeah, writing and reading, a total escape. Yeah, so I can see where you the author you referenced definitely has gone down that route and used, and you know, as an escape route. Definitely brilliant.
So, believe it or not, that's about 30 minutes.
I was just going to ask Dan though, when you were growing up, when you were at primary school, what were the books that switched you on?
The Twits always springs to mind. I can remember reading that. I can remember The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Mum did that as a bedtime read, and I couldn't wait to get to bed fast enough. You know, when she used to, she was just knew where to leave it. We said at the start of the chat, she knew where to leave it, the good bits. And also, and if we've got any teachers who are watching this, they might remember this. Teachers of a certain age, should I say? The Choose Your Own Adventure books. So you would start off reading page 1, and then you would get a choice of where to go. And you would then go off to page 47 and make decisions. And it almost felt like you were the creator of the story, which was really quite powerful as a child. So yeah, those 3 books I think definitely stuck in my mind. And the Beano. I used to sit by the front door on Beano delivery day. Love the Beano, absolutely.
Well, I hope everybody who's watching or listening has enjoyed our 30-odd minute chat with Dan Worsley. Dan, if, as you say, you do school visits, you have a website. Do you want to give it a shout? Because I can't really...
Yeah, it's danworsley.com, and all the details are on there. Email address is on there as well for contact. So yeah, World Book Day coming up. I think I've got 3 trips to the Fylde Coast, Blackpool, Thornton, and then I've got a day in Stoke-on-Trent, and I've got a day in Stockport.
Right.
So yeah, so it's quite
here,
there and everywhere.
How far will you go, Dan, for these visits?
Well, I did 3 days in Worcestershire in January. So an academy trust, some of the schools grouped together. So we did 2 days in one school, a middle school, and then half a day in a couple of other schools. So yeah, you know, if we can hatch a plan, I never say no. I'm always open to suggestions.
And just before we finish, Dan, what you've got those the trilogy is complete or might not be. What you know, the Impossible Tales. Is there another book coming along those?
Yeah, I think so. And probably the scary sort of, but the scary is so hard to do, because you know you can what for one child can be terrifying, another child can just laugh it off. So I many years ago experimented with this and created a story about a pair of false teeth that come to life in a lightning storm. So you got a bit of Frankenstein in there, and hunt down a grandma and the little boy in a farmhouse. It's all set in the dark, and to me it was more comedic. Imagining a pair of false teeth click-clacking their way around the house. And I did have some parents who contacted me to tell me that the children had had nightmares about these false teeth. So you can't win. You can't win.
No, you definitely can't win with that one.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dan, for joining us. Very special, the first time we've done Frankenstein chat like this. So thank you for doing it, and I hope, please feedback if you're a teacher or a child who's listened to Dan this morning and Frankenstein just wittering on about their reading experiences. Please let us know what you think, and whether or not we ought to do something similar going forward. But thank you, everybody, and enjoy World Book Day when it comes. And Dan, we'll have you back again this time next year, I think. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Same place, same time. See you later. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
you.